Hi, thank you. I am Dr. Heather Melton. I'm an associate professor at the University of Utah in the Department of Sociology, and I am here today to talk about stalking. I always start out with words of people who've experienced this, and one of the things over the years I've learned is that we very often tend to minimize this. I've had people tell me, "Well, what's the big deal? They're not really doing anything. It's not violent." And hopefully, that's one of the things you get out of this lecture today is that it really can be, and it can be very serious, and it can be very traumatic. So here are words of people who have actually experienced this behavior. I was scared to death to go out because I knew he'd be watching me or following me. I was afraid he'd confront me and it would be bad. Before I felt safe walking from my house to my car. Now I shut the blinds, locked the car, got caller ID. I'm afraid to go to anybody's house because if somebody was following me, they would now know where my friends live. I feel like I live under a microscope. He knows things about me that he shouldn't know. It affects everything. It bothers me. I moved jobs and we moved, and he called me one day and said, "I know where you work. I saw your car out there." That made me real nervous. I was so nervous all the time. I was watching the windows, just constantly looking down my back. That's how scary it was with him. So again, one of the things I hope you get out of this webinar is just how serious, how important it is to talk about this issue, and how traumatic it really can be for people who experience it. So I want to start kind of with some background, and I think a good place to start is just what is this behavior? And that's very interesting because one of the things that I find fascinating about stalking is it's very difficult to define because you're taking a behavior that in many situations is not illegal, is not against the law. And yet in certain contexts, you're making it an illegal behavior. So that's difficult to do. And when we first started studying this or looking at this, I'll talk a little bit about that background. For a long time, we're just talking about what is it? Because it's not just one incident, it's not just one behavior. It can be a lot of different behaviors. So is it, can it happen once? Does it have to happen multiple times? So it's not that easy to define. One of the and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about law, but a definition that I like to use is the willful, repeated, and malicious following, harassing, or threatening of another person that induces fear or concern for safety. And I'll come back to this a little when I talk about the legal definition. But some examples of behaviors that might fit under this: following, watching, laying in wait, unwanted calls, leaving and sending unwanted items, presents, damaging or threatening the victim's property, defaming the victim's character, harassing the victim via internet by posting personal information or spreading rumors about the victim, threatening or harming others close to the victim. So we really, obviously, this has been around for a long time and people have been engaging in this behavior for a very long time. But we really didn't identify it as a social or criminal problem until about 1989. So that is very recent, I would argue. And again, like I said, when we first started kind of talking about this, that there was a certain focus that has since shifted. But what happened, one of the things that happened, and you had your first statutes being created in California, it came after the murder of actress Rebecca Schaeffer. She was kind of an up-and-coming young actress, was getting a lot of attention because she was going to be on a new sitcom in that year. And she was eventually murdered by somebody who turned out had been stalking her. That case was linked to 5 other murder victims murders that occurred around the same time, where it was determined that the victims had restraining orders against their murderers. This got a lot of attention. Rebecca Schaeffer got a lot of attention. You're in got a lot of pop culture attention, a lot of newspaper articles, magazines, etc. And people really started talking about this. But like I said, it's a difficult behavior to define. So when we first defined it as a social problem, there really wasn't a law against it. So how do you make these statutes? And we weren't very good at this at the beginning because, again, it's a behavior that many of the initial statutes were pretty vague, and they counted situations that really weren't illegal situations. So how do we do this? So let me give you some examples of some of the initial statutes, and then I'll talk about Utah statute now. And I always give this example. When I was younger, I remember there was a boy I liked, and I used to ride my bike around the block, looking at his house. And was that stalking? I was, watching that house. I hope not. But what most of the statutes identify is how the person experiencing it perceives it. So I think that's very important. When we initially first started creating statutes, we didn't kind of have that in. Another example I often give is in some of the early statutes, they actually required an overt threat. And this was problematic. So let me give you an example. There was a case where I had talked to a victim who had actually gone underground. She had experienced a severe abuse from her abuser and later stalker. And she had gone underground, which is not easy. She had given up her career. She had given up her friends and family. And she was constantly moving around. And she said every time she moved to a new location, within a couple of weeks of being there, there'd be flowers on her porch. Well, she took this to police, and they said, "Oh, look, no, that's nice. He wants you back. He's giving you flowers. That's a nice thing." Well, she took it as, no, this is him threatening me. This is him telling me he knows where I am. But at the time, the law in that state required there to be an overt threat, and they didn't count this. So we've spent a lot of time kind of trying to tweak the statutes to cover the situations we really want them to cover. Today, all states have some form of stalking legislation, and let me just go over Utah's, and I'll highlight some of the important parts, I think, of the statute. So, stalking in Utah, the Utah statute, a person is guilty of stalking who intentionally or knowingly, and this is important because, again, it's not just that you accidentally shop at the same grocery store, it's that you intentionally or knowingly engages in a course of conduct directed at a specific person and knows or should know that the course of conduct would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or suffer emotional distress. So again, another part of this that's important is that course of conduct. That one of the things initially when we were seeing these cases, certainly when they came to the criminal justice system, one of the problems was they would look at incident by incident by incident. And they actually might not sound that bad if you're just looking at one incident. But when you suddenly see that this has been going on for weeks or months or years, it looks very different. So it's the overall behaviors. It's not necessarily that one incident, which makes it different from many other crimes. Reasonable person, and this is something that I really want to highlight throughout this webinar. It's important to remember this because the relationship that the victim has with the stalker might change kind of some of those perceptions, and so that's something that I really would like to highlight. So it would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety, so experience fear, or suffer emotional distress. And again, so this, one of the things that's so important about stalking is it really puts it's the perception of the victim, how they're experiencing it. So one person might experience this behavior and not fear for their safety or not suffer emotional distress versus another who might. So it's important to really take into consideration how that victim is experiencing the behavior. Here are just some examples. Engages in a course of conduct, 2 or more events that are related, where they're followed, monitored, observed, photographed, surveilled, threatened, communicated, interfering with property. Or approaches the person, appears at workplace, contacts their employer, appears at residence, contacts neighbors, sends materials to or about the person, places an object on person's property, or uses electronic means to commit an act that is part of this course of conduct. And again, I think it's really important to kind of see how the person experiencing this, their perspective, because it's fear or suffer emotional distress. That means significant mental or psychological suffering, regardless of whether or not medical treatment or counseling is required. So that's not that they don't have to actually seek treatment, but if they experience that. And a reasonable person is a reasonable person, but in the victim's circumstances. And this is going to become very important for the rest of the webinar, where I'm going to talk about some of those victim circumstances that as professionals who deal with victims of stalking, it's very important to think about that and to take that into consideration. Okay, just a little more background. Again, this is like sexual assault, like intimate partner abuse. Stalking is very difficult to know how prevalent it is. There are many good reasons why somebody experiencing this might not be reporting it, so you certainly can't use kind of what gets reported to the police. There are also reasons why somebody might not respond on a survey. One of the things I always talk about with all these issues of gender-based violence is I think there's something about putting it down on a piece of paper. No matter how much somebody's telling you something's anonymous, nobody's going to see it, nobody's going to know it's you. There is something about putting it down, writing it down, that I think a lot of people who are experiencing it might not be ready to do. So it's a difficult behavior. It's difficult because different researchers define it different ways. So it's hard to kind of do those comparisons. It's the people experiencing it define it different ways. So again, if you're just asking questions and they aren't defining the behavior they're experiencing in the way you're asking the question, they might not answer the question the way that really they have experienced that behavior. So just take all the numbers with a grain of salt. They're probably greatly underreporting this problem, I would say, just because there are a lot of good reasons why people aren't reporting, and as even the research and how we define it and how we ask the questions about it is getting better, there's still more improvement that could be done. So early estimates put it at over about 1 million a year. A 2007 U.S. Department of Justice report found that 3.4 million persons over 18 or older were victims of stalking over a 12-month period. If you lower the burden a little, it goes up and to include 5.9 million, including harassment. And often the harassment definitions don't include that suffer the fear or suffering serious emotional distress. So it can go up considerably if you include that. The 2011 CDC National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey found that there were about 7.5 million victims of stalking. So clearly it's a serious issue. One of the things I do want to point out that I think is important, and I don't want to minimize anything, but all of the studies show that there's significantly more female victims than male, and significantly more male offenders than female. So I think that's important to remember. I think that it is very important to recognize that there are male victims and that they might face even greater barriers in seeking help and seeking support. And there are female offenders that we need to deal with as well. But overall, this is seen as an issue of violence against women. So I think that's important, recognizing and not minimizing that there are male victims, and that again they might have unique service needs. One of the things I like to talk a little bit about again is kind of how society sees this problem, because this is one of the things that I think has a great impact on how we talk about this in our daily lives, and of course how society sees this, how media portrays this, certainly can kind of feed into how people who are experiencing it see it, or others around them see it, and so it can have great impacts. So I think it's important to think about with stalking in particular, that the media, TV, books, movies, they often portray romantic behavior as fairly indistinguishable from stalking. When you think about movies, how many movies that the premise is the person trying to convince the other person that they want to date them or go out with them or be with them, and they spend all the movie trying to do that, and then of course and the other person saying no, and then in the end they're together. So I think this is very common that we kind of portray stalking as actually normal courtship behavior, which I think that's dangerous and that has some consequences. I've listed some movies here where you can kind of see some of these stalking behaviors. You can see this little cartoon. I've been here every night watching you sleep. Oh, Edward, that's ever so romantic. You can see some of these movies. Some of these are movies that I certainly have enjoyed and loved. But I think that can send some mixed messages and can have some pretty serious consequences, certainly for people who are experiencing this when they are trying to seek help or tell people or talk to other people about it, the responses they might get based on kind of how society does portray this. You can see I have jokes. I mean, another thing that's been really interesting in studying stalking in the time period that I've been studying it is just the impact of social media. Things like Facebook. You can see some of these jokes are about Facebook, where, on Facebook, it's kind of the norm. It's socially acceptable that you're allowed to kind of see what somebody's doing, follow them. You can check in. But in real life, we see that as creepy. And I would argue, you can see some of these other jokes. You told me you were busy last night, but I can see from your Facebook status log that you were just watching TV. In reality, this, again, like I said, can have some serious consequences. I think this leads to people not taking it seriously, people thinking it's a joke. I mean, we've heard people say things like, oh, well, I'm going to Facebook stalk you. It's come part of our conversation, part of our language. And I think that can certainly minimize the problem. So now I'm just going to show a short video that illustrates some of these points.
Thanks for leaving your curtains open, just enough for me to peek through. I was hiding in the dark behind a tree in your front yard, and you didn't have a clue. Packed my cooler with a snack, got myself all dressed in black so I could secretly watch you. I'm stalking you. Did you know that I'm stalking you? Now you do. Exactly where you are. I'm 50 feet behind your car. You might think that I am a jerk just because I followed you home from work. It's really not that far. I document every move you make with the black and white pictures I take that hang up in my room. I'm stalking you. Did you know that I'm stalking you? Now you do. But don't worry, you're not in danger. My motive is not hate. I love the way that you walk. I tap your phone so I can hear you talk. I think your voice is great. I am hiding in your room with my video camera on zoom so I can rewind you. I'm stalking you. I'm stalking you. They didn't know that I was stalking you. but now you do.
Okay, so thank you. Normally when I'm doing this in person, I ask about your responses to that. But I show that, to show how this is being portrayed. You can go on YouTube and there are tons and tons of these. Just put in stalking and you'll see tons of videos like this. And again, I think one of the problems is what does this do? It shows it as kind of funny. It certainly shows when you see in that video the stalker. Would you be able to recognize that person walking down the street? Yes, they're clearly identifiable. They're wearing a bag over their head, when in reality we know that's just not the case. So the impact of all this, again, I think is that we tend to minimize this. I can't even tell you, I started this out saying this, how many times I've been told by people, when I tell them what I do, what I research, where they say, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? They're really not doing anything. They're just watching them. Why would that bother you? They're not violent, which is, again, something I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it really gets minimized and we don't take it seriously. And I think, again, how we're portraying this in our society, in our media, in our culture, plays a big part of this. That it gets trivialized. Again, we treat it as a joke, and we have jokes about, you can look up jokes on stalking, you can find lots of jokes, but it gets trivialized, not taken seriously, and that this can again have serious consequences, certainly for people experiencing it. But we all, kind of like rape myths and rape culture, we all kind of are part of this. And so when people try and talk to other people about this problem, that's the response they get, even if they do take it seriously. So this is problematic. That just like many of these other crimes, the way we talk about this, we engage in serious victim blaming. Because what do we say? Well, if they don't want to experience this, they should just say no. They should just tell them to stop. Well, they are. And it's not stopping. And when you say, well, they should just do this, they should do that, that's implying that when they don't, that it's somehow their fault. So I think we often tend to blame the victims for the experience. Well, they must be getting something out of it, or they'd be stopping their behavior, when that is just not true. Another issue with stalking is this issue of psychopathology, and I'll talk about different types, and this does come into play, but I think we do have a tendency to reduce it to some psychological problem. And there certainly are some stalkers, by very definition, that is an issue that's going on. But for the vast majority, I don't think that's what it's about. And this is going to lead me into my next section, where I really want to talk about the type of stalking that is the most prevalent, which is the type that occurs in intimate partner relationships. That's not what we think about, but that is the type that's most prevalent. So I'd be careful. I don't think we should reduce it. I don't think we should reduce it to necessarily a psychological disorder, even though, again, there are some people who are doing this that might be a problem, but for the vast majority, that's not what is going on. Here is a short video on the reality of stalking.
My name is Erin Brockovich, and I host the Lifetime television series, Final Justice. What you are about to see is a story about a crime that is misunderstood and far too often deadly: stalking. Peggy Klinke was stalked relentlessly by an ex-boyfriend. If you haven't experienced it, it's very hard to imagine the terror of what it feels like.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. You know, in the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her.
calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, he was just going to persist with this.
At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it, wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her, and put her cell phone number on it, and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting.
That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks.
Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors.
Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating, and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating, and in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, "Will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?"
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen?
So you can see that was very different than the other video. And in this case, her stalker ended up getting on a plane, flying to where she was, and finding her and killing her while she was on the phone with 911. So obviously stalking can have some very, very serious consequences. Okay, I want to talk briefly about different types of stalkers. And again, the bulk of my talk will focus on intimate partner stalkers, but I just want you to be aware that there are other types. So when we first started talking about this problem, the main focus was on stranger stalkers. And again, I don't want to minimize that because it is a very traumatic experience for anyone who's experiencing this. But a lot of our knowledge, when we first started looking at this in the 90s in particular, was based on these stranger situations. A lot of what most of us think about is based on strangers. We think of celebrities. We hear about this on TMZ, the celebrities having stalkers. And again, that can be very serious, but there seem to be some pretty significant differences between stranger stalkers and intimate partner stalkers. One of the things that I do want to point out about stranger stalkers is very often the stalker themselves is suffering from some sort of delusion. So they do have some sort of psychological disorder. And two that have been mentioned are erotomania or love obsessional. And basically this means erotomanic stalkers, they have the delusion that they have a relationship with this person. So here's a person they've never met. Maybe they've seen their movies, but they in their mind, they feel like they have a relationship with this person, and it's their job to convince this person that they are in a relationship. And love obsessional is similar, except that they might have other sort of delusions about other things in their lives as well. So again, important. A lot of the initial research focused on this, but what has come out over the past decade or so is that this is not the most common. And that if we want to really look at this issue, we need to talk about other types. So another type is acquaintance, and I'm not going to talk much about that, but it certainly is prevalent, where it might be a coworker, it might be a neighbor, somebody you know starts engaging in this behavior. But by far, the vast majority of stalking is actually occurring in intimate partner relationships, which I think for many was surprising. How is that possible? They know each other. How can this behavior be possible? But we are finding that it is quite common. So most victims are most often the current, and I'll talk a little bit about that because people are like, how is that possible? If they're in a relationship, they live together, how could this be happening? I'll talk about that some. Or former spouses or intimate partners of their stalkers. One study put it as high as 80% of all stalking cases involve a current or former intimate. And part of that also, and I think this is really important to talk about, is that there's a high correlation between intimate partner abuse and stalking. So very often in these relationships where there is stalking, it was characterized by abuse prior to the stalking or even during the stalking. So one study found that 80% of victims of stalking reported having been physically assaulted by a partner that later stalked them, and 31% reported having been sexually assaulted. So all these things go together. And I think it's important to think about that, to talk about that, and to look at that when we're trying to do research on stalking. One of the things I just want to talk briefly about is the relationship between stalking and sexual assault. And certainly there is a relationship. There's a correlation there. So we need to think about that and talk about that. Stranger sexual assault, there is some evidence of a connection. Interviews with convicted rapists reveal that they do target specific victims, watch them over time, wait for an opportunity. So there is some evidence that these two things are related and that both need to be addressed when you're responding to this problem. There's very little on acquaintance and date sexual assault, which I think there needs to be much more research on this, and by that I mean, stalking that's occurring before the sexual assault happens or after the sexual assault happens. Very little research on this. By far, the most research is on intimate partner assault. And this relationship between stalking and sexual assault that occurs in intimate partner relationships. And we know that it is highly correlated. There's more so, there's some evidence that indicates that people who experience stalking and sexual assault in an intimate partner relationship versus not experiencing sexual assault may actually have more negative outcomes and are at higher risk for repeat offenses. So again, it's very important that we look at this and really figure out, really respond appropriately to this problem so that we're really addressing the needs of people experiencing this. I also think it's important to point out that particularly in intimate partner research, I mean, we're just beginning to have good research on sexual assault that occurs within intimate partner relationships. And I think we need more nuanced research using more detailed and more nuanced definitions and measurements. So, for example, kind of getting at the coercive aspects of sexual assault that can go on in a relationship, to really kind of figure out these behaviors, figure out what's going on, why the correlation is there between stalking and sexual assault, and comparing those to cases where it's not, and kind of see what those differences are and what that implies for then how we should be responding to this. So what I'd like to spend the rest of the time talking about is really the differences between intimate partner stalkers and those other types. And the reason I think this is so important is because, again, initially most of the research did not focus on this, and they focused on the stranger stalkers. But these are the people that you're most likely to be dealing with. So if you're going into, if you're working in this field and you're dealing with victims, you're very likely to experience, the people you're dealing with, your clients, are very likely, this is the type they're likely to have experienced. So I think it's important to think about that. And again, one of the things I want to stress is, particularly when you're thinking about that reasonable person threshold for the legal statutes, because I think when you add that intimate partner relationship, that history, that can change how somebody interpret things. So I think it's really important to think about that, because you listening to something might not think something sounds that bad, but if you're then listening to that in the context of this person experienced abuse from their stalker, that might kind of change how you see that behavior. So I think it's really important to think about that. And again, I should have said this in the beginning, but what I'm really trying to do here, I'm a researcher, so I'm presenting you the research that hopefully can guide you and you can use when you are interacting with people who are really experiencing this. I always say the people who are working with this on a day-to-day basis and the people who are experiencing this, you guys are the experts. But hopefully I can give you some glimpse into the research and that can help you in how you respond or how you see this problem. So what I want to talk about the differences. I want to talk about differences in relationship history or context, differences in the stalking tactics, differences in the increased risk for violence and threats. I think that's one that often surprises people. Differences in stalkers themselves, and then the mental and physical health effects. And again, I want to stress, I think it's difficult. You can never say one thing's worse than the other, because all of it is going to depend on somebody's past experiences. But I would say that this type of stalking, intimate partner stalking, has very often been minimized, and I don't want us to do that anymore. Okay, so the relationship history or context. And so again, what I'm doing here is I'm talking about research that looks at intimate partner stalking versus other types of stalking, which would be those stranger stalkers or acquaintance stalkers. As I said, we know there's a high correlation between stalking in a relationship and psychological, physical, and/or sexual abuse. So we know that they're all highly correlated. And I think it's important to think about that, again, when you're dealing with somebody who's experiencing this, because this is going to provide cues that often only the stalker and the victim can understand. So if you go back to my example of the woman who was receiving flowers from her stalker when he was indicating that he knew where she was, and she goes to the police and they say, "Oh, look, that's so nice." In that case, they had a long history of abuse where he had almost killed her. She knows that when he gave her flowers, this is what happened afterwards. So that is something that only they might know, only they might see it like that. But is going to have that person is going to see this behavior completely differently than somebody on the outside would. And so it's important to really listen to what somebody is telling you about. I always say, if they're saying that this is not okay, then that's not okay. Because they're the ones, they have this relationship, they have this context that they understand what this means. And so again, it's you have to be very careful on the outside when you're talking to somebody who's experiencing this to really try and understand it from their perspective and to understand that something that, again, you might not see as serious based on that past history, might cause way more fear than it would in somebody else. So that reasonable person, again, it's a reasonable person in that victim's circumstances. So it's very important to remember that when you're working with this population. That it provides the stalker with more access to the victim. They know their routines, friends, family. They know who to call. They know who to talk to. I think this is important, particularly important when we're responding to this, because there's a lot more information that stalker can find out because they have this access. And so they're able to utilize these other people to access the victim. And so when people don't know what's going on, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I mean, if people aren't talking about this, if people don't want others to know, and this stalker has a lot of access to those people, that's going to make it very difficult to stop and to deal with. So this is important, and this certainly leads to a qualitative difference, I would argue, between the stalking that might occur, because they know where you are, they know where you shop, they know where you go, they know, what you're doing. And so they're able they're much more able to access you in person than they would if they didn't have that access. Similarly to all of this, it really can change the victim's response or interpretation of the stalking. So again, if they've experienced severe psychological or physical abuse during the relationship, that certainly can increase their fear that they experience when they see this. Just seeing this person could increase their fear. So it's important to remember their circumstances based on their past history with this person and how that can change their perception of the behavior. I would argue that there's a qualitative difference in the stalking itself. And again, some of this is just based on that past history. One of the things we know is that intimate partner stalkers tend to engage in a wider variety of stalking behaviors and do so more frequently and for longer periods of time. It's likely to last. It's likely to occur on a more frequent basis and then last for a much longer period of time. And I mean, I think one of the reasons are this context, this history that they have together. So they have more access and knowledge, so they know where to find them. They know who their friends are. They may have children. I have that up there. They may have children in common. One of the things that I've certainly heard very often talking to people who've experienced this is how the person is finding out about them through the children. And that could be that, they are allowed to call about the children. So they call about the children, but then they engage in the stalking behavior. They start harassing them, threatening them, doing other things. Or it could be they're just finding information out from the children. A lot of people don't want to, have their kids know the details of what's going on. And so they're finding out where they're going to be, et cetera, from the kids. So these are important things to think about, again, when we're kind of responding to this. One of the things I talk about that I think is particularly important with intimate partner stalking is this issue of proxy stalking. And what I mean by this is one of the things that came out in interviews that I did a while ago, and this wasn't something I was expecting, but when I was asking, these were qualitative interviews where I was basically just asking people who experienced this to describe the overall behavior. I think I had 5 questions and asked them the questions, but then they really just talked about how it started, what it was like, etc. And one of the things that came out of this was how prevalent, how often they would talk about how it wasn't just their ex-husband or their husband or their boyfriend or it wasn't just that person, that person would also have other people do it with them. They either would have somebody come with them, they would have their brother, their cousin, or they would have other people doing it maybe when they were incapacitated. So if they were in jail for a short period of time, they would have their mother calling the victim or somebody else saying, I saw you do this, I saw you there. So even if we're providing resources to deal with what I would call the primary stalker, there might be other people that are engaging in this behavior. And some of those resources, some of those responses might not cover that other person. So I think this is particularly important to think about when we're talking about this type of stalking, that other people might be involved. And so when we respond to it, we need to address those other people. Because if the primary stalker is incapacitated, that doesn't necessarily mean that the stalking has stopped. So that's an important consideration. we do know that this type of stalking is likely to be precipitated by a single event. And by far, the most common thing that happens is that the relationship ends. It's interesting, though, and this relates to the issue of timing, because one of the things that's certainly come out in my research and certainly in other research is that for many, this is a behavior that's actually been going on throughout the relationship. What changes is they just don't define it as such. And certainly we do know that it changes qualitatively after the relationship ends. So let me give you some examples of this. I remember I was doing interviews with some victims, and I remember this one woman who was talking about, and it was now her ex-husband, but she was talking about how when they first started dating, he would show up at her office every day. He would take her out to lunch every day. He would show up at her office when she was done with work and take her home. And at the time, she just said, oh my gosh, he loves me so much. He cares about me so much. He wants to see me this often. And it was only after the abuse she experienced, the further stalking behaviors, that she kind of said, oh no, that was a red flag. That was the same thing then that it is now. But she didn't define it as that. Very often, again, people don't think they can be experiencing this because, hey, I live with the person. But I think what's important to think about is you think about it very similarly to intimate partner abuse, that it's really the same behavior, or it's just the same thing. It's just a slightly different behavior, but it's being used for the same purposes. So I think it is very common to have the behavior occur throughout the relationship, but then we do know that having the relationship end really can qualitatively change the intensity, the severity, because very often this person may have had physical access to the victim and now suddenly they don't. So this is now the continuation of that. This is their method of trying to continue to have control over that person. So we do know, again, this is qualitatively different than other types of stalking that other people experience when there's this intimate partner relationship. And I think that issue of timing is really important to think about, because for many there is evidence of this going on throughout. So that's an important thing. Like I said at the beginning, one of the things we do know that this type of stalking, they are likely to engage in a longer period of time compared to other types. And the reason this is important is because we do know that the longer the stalking goes on, the greater the mental and emotional health effects that it can have. So we know that this type of stalking can be particularly detrimental to mental and emotional health. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't think about with intimate partner stalking is the risk of violence and threats. And again, I don't want to minimize stranger stalkers. They can be very violent. They can certainly end up in death. But we know that this type of stalking is actually more likely to end up in violence. Intimate partner stalkers are more likely to threaten their victims, and they're more likely to behave violently towards their victims. And I think if you think about it, the vast majority of these cases have a history of abuse, so they've already behaved violently and they've already behaved threateningly towards their victims. So it makes sense that this behavior might continue. So it's estimated that 25 to 35% of cases of intimate partner stalking will end up in violence. So that's a significant portion. And then I think what's particularly important is to look at homicide. 29 to 54% of all female murder victims are battered women, and in 90% of these cases, it's believed that stalking preceded the murder. So again, even though the behavior itself might not be violent, it very well might end up in violence and ultimately could end up in the ultimate type of violence, homicide. So one of the reasons why we need to take this behavior very seriously is because of this increased risk of violence and threats. That's particularly pertinent for intimate partner stalkers and stalking victims. It's also important to remember that this type of stalker is more likely to behave violently towards third-party victims. As you saw in that video, the new boyfriend of the victim was targeted as well. One in a study I had done, it was interesting because it was measuring kind of just stalking behaviors. I was just trying to figure out the behaviors that people experienced. And when you controlled for whether or not the victim had a new partner, because obviously the stalker can't behave violently towards a new partner if they don't have one, but when you controlled for that, it was almost 75% of the cases the new partner had actually experienced violence or threats from the stalker. So again, this is important for when we're responding. This is important for when we're offering protections, that there might be other people in the periphery that might need some of that as well, not in addition to the primary victim. We do know that there are some differences in the stalkers themselves. So this is, again, kind of comparing intimate partner stalkers to most often stranger stalkers. Intimate partner stalkers are significantly less likely than stranger acquaintance stalkers to be psychotic or delusional. That very often it's not about that, and again, I think this is kind of when we talk about psychopathology, we tend to do this with all stalkers, and there are some certainly that are psychotic or delusional, but the vast majority are not, and the vast majority of these are likely to be intimate partner stalkers. They are more likely than stranger stalkers to be diagnosed as antisocial or with narcissistic personality disorder. So that's a difference. They tend to have different motivations than stranger stalkers. Very often, again, it's about control, about power, about the relationship ending and losing that control. They might be trying to get the person back, but very often that's again about power and control. So this can be very different from stranger stalkers. And one of the things we also know that I think is important in terms of our response is they're more likely to have substance abuse or alcohol problems. So that's something that, and not that causes the behavior at all, it doesn't, but it's important to take into consideration when we're responding to this problem or offering services. Lastly, again, I don't think it's a good idea to ever say one thing's worse than the other, because it's all very individual, and depending upon that individual's life and circumstances, how they respond to this. But I do, again, often think this intimate partner stalking gets minimized. And I think it's important to recognize that this type of stalking actually has increased mental and physical health effects for the victims. So studies indicate that 70 to 80% of victims of intimate partner stalking will experience some psychological distress. This includes anxiety, depression, flashbacks, nightmares, so on. And that we know that this is actually increased if the stalking is occurring in this context of a violent former or current relationship. And again, like I said before, we know that the duration of the stalking contributes. So the longer the stalking goes on, the greater the mental and physical health effects for the victims. And so since this type of stalking is likely to last longer, we know it has increased mental and physical health effects for the victims. So this can be very serious and can have some very negative consequences for people who experience this. So that's important to take into consideration when you're dealing with somebody who's experiencing this, because they likely are having some of those effects. One of the things that I've tried to do, and other researchers have tried to do as well, is to say, well, can we predict which abusers will become stalkers? So, and again, the importance of this would be in terms of how we're responding to this, because many of these people may have criminal justice interaction. And so that'd be important to be able to do that. So we know if, people need varying services or we have to have varying responses to some of these problems. So I in a study, I tried to do that. So basically what I'm doing here, this is now no longer comparing it to stranger stalkers, but doing a comparison of intimate partner relationships that involve abuse versus intimate partner relationships that involve abuse and stalking. And one of the things I found in those relationships where there's stalking in addition to abuse, so this is, the stalkers versus those that just experience abuse, one, that the stalkers, abusers / stalkers are more likely to have an alcohol or drug problem. Again, what this means is when somebody comes in and we know that that's an issue, that's something to think about in terms of the response, and that might set somebody up for increased risk of experiencing this behavior. That they're not be in a relationship with their victim. That's kind of, that's expected, but kind of comparing those differences, that there is something about that relationship ending that does indicate that this behavior might start or increase after the relationship ends. And then if you go back and look at the context of the relationship, that you find that the people the abusers who end up stalking are more likely to exhibit controlling behaviors towards their victims during the relationship. So again, what this means is somebody who is seeking services, if they have these increased risk factors, that they might be at increased risk for experiencing stalking from that abuser. Another study found similar things. They found that stalking was highly correlated with psychological abuse. So the more psychological abuse that somebody experiences in a relationship, the more likely they're going to experience stalking when that relationship ends. And they found severe stalking was highly correlated with all severe physical, severe emotional, and severe sexual abuse. So again, the importance of this and the importance of this is just to think about this when we're responding, and recognize that there are people that might be at increased risk for experiencing this behavior, and so we have to respond appropriately and give them the resources that they really might need to deal with these behaviors. Okay, I want to spend just a little time talking about this response to this problem, so the police and court response. There's been very little research on this issue related specifically to intimate partner stalking. There's much more kind of related to stalking in general, and which is important to do that as well. But I think one of the issues that happens with intimate partner stalking that's important to think about and to figure out how to deal with is, while stalking is a crime in its own right, and there are anti-stalking statutes in most places, the criminal justice response to stalking when it's occurring in this context of an intimate partner, certainly when it's occurring in the context of intimate partner abuse, but when it's an intimate partner, has actually been to treat it similar to intimate partner abuse. And so we don't know that much about kind of the stalking part of this equation, because we kind of just treat it like intimate partner abuse. And one of the things I'll talk about in a minute, victims have talked about how they want this part of it dealt with as well as the abuse. So one of the things that I've looked at and been interested in, there have been a lot of changes in how we respond to intimate partner abuse over the last several decades. And one of the things I was interested in is when we do have a criminal justice response to abuse. So, for example, many jurisdictions have mandatory arrest or mandatory prosecution or other policies such as those. What we have traditionally measured as an outcome of that is whether or not just the abuse is reduced. But I've wondered if the stalking is maybe they're no longer physically abusive, but maybe they're engaging in some other behaviors, and stalking can be one of those behaviors because now they don't have physical access, so maybe they're doing this other behavior. So have we really decreased it? And in my research and others, one of the things I have found that evidence that stalking decreases after criminal justice intervention. However, I want to point out that in that study, it decreased, but it actually decreased at a significantly lower rate than the abuse, meaning that the abuse was significantly more likely to decrease than the stalking. So even though it did decrease, there were still some people experiencing stalking, whereas the abuse decreased significantly. So I think this is important to think about, again, because very often we kind of confuse, or we deal with these problems in the same way, and we probably need to be looking at doing a little bit more, and certainly looking at the outcomes and of stalking and intimate partner abuse separately to kind of see what's going on, to really know what impact we're having and what the most appropriate response is to this problem. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, because one of the things that's important to me is listening to the victims, because like I said, I think they're the experts on this. They know what they want done. They know what needs to be done. They know when something isn't right. And so I think that's one of the most important things that the criminal justice system and personnel in the criminal justice system can do, is to really listen to what the victims are saying about what they would like to see done. So I just have a few here. By far the most common thing I've heard in my 20 years of researching this is they want to be listened to and they want to be believed. Because very often I think a common reaction to this behavior is, oh, am I overreacting? Nobody's going to believe this. Nobody's going to take this seriously. And again, I when you're experiencing this in an intimate partner relationship, you know the context of that. You know what happened before, and that's, again, going to change how you perceive it. And so they want other people to listen and believe them. So I think that's the most important thing any of us can do is to listen and believe people who are experiencing this and what they're telling us. And if they're saying it's serious, then believe it's serious. Many talked about more monitoring of the stalker. They felt that the criminal justice system intervened. They might do something, but then there wasn't any follow through. They weren't monitoring the person. And again, maybe the abuse stopped, but that didn't necessarily mean some of these other behaviors stopped. So they wanted not necessarily specific ideas about what that would be, but more monitoring, more following of the person who's doing this. Many people have mentioned more attention to stalking, even when there's intimate partner abuse occurring. So they wanted this dealt with in its own right, not just as intimate partner abuse, that they wanted the stalking itself dealt with and thought it should be dealt with differently than intimate partner abuse. I've also had a lot of victims talk about more protection should be offered to victims, and that certainly protective orders should be enforced. And there are various reasons in various places why you have differences in protective orders, but by and large, they wanted those protective orders enforced. If I'm telling you he's out there watching me and he's not supposed to be, please enforce that. He's not supposed to be doing that. And that it needs to be taken seriously in harsher punishments, that victims often talked about how they felt, again, their case wasn't taken seriously, that people thought they were overreacting, which what I urge you all to do is again, remember that victim's circumstances and how they're seeing things, because that really might change how we see the behavior if we take that into account. But take it seriously and have harsher punishments. I'd just like to end, and I always have people ask me this, and again, you guys are the experts, so I'm not telling you what to do or what to say, but some things to think about when people ask, what should I do if I'm experiencing this? I have students who experience this every semester, and that's always the first thing they ask is what should I do? Again, by far, I think what we can do when we have friends who experience this, or people we know who experience this, that we just need to listen to and believe them, because very often they're not getting that from people they tell, and that can have very serious consequences if people aren't listening and believing them. A very unfortunate thing about this particular behavior is if you are experiencing this, you need to document, which puts a huge burden on the victims. I've heard over and over again, the first thing I want to do when I get a message from him is just delete it. When I get an email, I want to delete. I don't want to see it again. I never want to think about it. But unfortunately, you have to kind of start showing that course of conduct. So you need to keep the letters, keep the emails, keep the messages, to just kind of document what's happening. And again, it's hard. And I never want to tell people what to do, but one of the things I think, particularly with intimate partner stalking, we have to think about is if others know. Because one of the things we know is very often the stalkers are using those other people that might not know exactly what's going on, and they're able to get at their victims through these other people. So if family and friends know what's going on, and that can be very difficult to tell people, but if they know what's going on, then they know not to tell this person something. But if they don't know, it's very easy for the stalkers to kind of get at get at the victims, find information about the victims. This is another one that's not easy. Cease contact with the stalker. I think we often think if I just do this, if I just say this in the right way, this will stop. But that in this particular behavior, that's just not the case. And so one of the best things you can do is just try and cease contact with the stalker. Not always possible, but try to do that. I always urge people to obtain a protective or restraining order. I know that for many, they see it as just a piece of paper that's not going to do anything. But there is research out there that shows that one of the things with protective orders is when something happens, law enforcement is more likely to enforce those. But it also, again, kind of goes back to this document that you're keeping. You have a paper trail now that you've done some of these, engaged in done some of these things that the system is going to expect you to have done. Again, not my place to tell anyone what to do, but involving law enforcement is another, they have resources to deal with this. And again, it's that documentation when you're doing that something might not happen at that time, but it might happen eventually if you're involving law enforcement. And lastly, just like with many of these issues, having a safety plan, knowing what you're going to do, knowing who you're going to go to, who you're going to call, I think can be a very important part of this. So thank you. Again, hopefully one of the things you get out of this is just how serious this problem is, but also, some of our stereotypes about it, how it occurs, that this is most likely to occur in intimate partner relationships, and to think about that how that might change the perspective when you're responding or helping people who are going through this problem. Thank you.